Welcome back to Chess E4E5. Today we're analyzing a brilliant victory from round 3 of the second UzChess Cup 2025. On the white side, we have Grandmaster Nodirbek Abdusattorov, rated 2767 and representing Uzbekistan, a young world-class talent known for his precision and deep understanding. On the black side, we have Grandmaster Richard Rapport, rated 2714, representing Romania, a creative and unpredictable player with a unique style. The game begins with Abdusattorov playing pawn to e4, and Rapport replies with pawn to c5, entering the Sicilian defense. White plays knight to f3, and black defends with pawn to d6. Abdusattorov strikes the center with pawn to d4, and after pawn takes d4, he recaptures with knight takes d4. Black continues with knight to f6, and white develops with knight to c3. Rapport brings out knight to c6, and white plays bishop to c4, aiming at the f7 square. Black plays pawn to e6, preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop. Abdusattorov continues with bishop to e3, and Rapport plays pawn to a6, possibly preparing b5. White retreats with bishop to b3, and black challenges the bishop with knight to a5. White plays pawn to f4, initiating kingside space, and black places the queen on c7. Abdusattorov aggressively pushes pawn to g4, and Rapport replies with pawn to d5, counterattacking in the center. White captures with pawn takes d5, and black plays bishop to b4, pinning the knight. Then comes pawn takes on e6 by white, and Rapport replies with knight takes b3, a tactical decision. White recaptures with pawn to cx b3, and black plays bishop takes c3 check, forcing simplification. White plays pawn to bx c3, and black continues with queen takes c3 check. The king steps aside to f2, and Rapport captures with bishop takes e6. White answers with knight takes e6, and black plays pawn takes e6. Now Abdusattorov activates rook to c1, and Rapport plays queen to b2 check. The king goes to f3, and black plays rook to d8. White places queen on c2, offering the queen trade, and after queen takes c2, rook takes c2, the queens are off the board. Rapport plays knight to d5, and white centralizes with rook to e1. Black castles kingside with short castling, and white plays pawn to h4, gaining space on the king side. Rapport brings his rook to c8, and the rooks are exchanged after rook takes c8, rook takes c8. Abdusattorov plays bishop to d4, and Rapport brings the king to f7. Then comes rook to e5 by white, challenging the center. Black plays knight to e7, and white reroutes with rook to c5, exchanged immediately after rook takes c5, bishop takes c5. Rapport plays knight to c6, and white improves with king to d4. Black plays pawn to g6, trying to activate his kingside pawns, and white responds with bishop to b6. Then comes pawn to h5 by black, and white takes with pawn takes h5, and pawn takes h5 by black. Abdusattorov plays pawn to f5, opening lines. Rapport defends with knight to e7, and white breaks through with pawn takes e6 check. Black plays king takes e6, and white calmly places the bishop on f2. Rapport jumps back with knight to d5, and white repositions with bishop to e1. Black pushes pawn to b6, and white plays bishop to d2. Rapport plays pawn to b5, and white responds with bishop to a5, pinning the knight. Black plays knight to e7, and white continues with king to f4. Rapport plays knight to c6, and white drops the bishop to c3. Black plays pawn to a5, trying to create counterplay. Abdusattorov continues with king to g5, and Rapport pushes pawn to a4. White plays pawn to b4, and black plays knight to e7 again. Then comes king takes h5, and black plays knight to d5. White places bishop on d2, and Rapport plays king to f5. Abdusattorov plays pawn to a3, and black plays knight to b6. White plays king to h6, and Rapport tries knight to c4. White goes bishop to c3, and black captures pawn takes a3. Then comes pawn to h5 by white, and black plays knight to b1, followed by bishop to a1 by white. Rapport plays knight to d2, and white continues with king to g7. Black plays knight to e4, and white pushes pawn to h6. Black tries knight to g5, and white calmly plays bishop to b2. Black checks with knight to e6, but white steps aside with king to g8, and black repeats with knight to g5. Abdusattorov plays bishop to c1, and Rapport pushes pawn to a3. Then comes bishop takes g5, followed by pawn to a2, and finally bishop to f6. With no hope left, Rapport resigns. A stunning display of technique and pressure by Abdusattorov, who kept full control from start to finish. He played with clinical precision and converted every small advantage with confidence. If you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. See you next time on Chess E4 E5.